Perfect. Well, thanks so much. Thanks to those folks online for joining us, of course, this morning. And for those of you in person, it's really terrific to be here. I've been doing this for about 34 years. A little bit about me. 34 years I've been part of the labor. Literally came out of college and moved for 3 months to see what it was like. It was a pretty good job, and we had to make sure we paid some bills. And in the spring of 1990, and 34 years later, still doing this work and the work is worth the life. And the work more recently that we are doing collectively in the labor movement around teenagers and trying to do the transition, to help to make sure that the transition is for the community is one that is that we've done in the It's so pleased that myself and some of my colleagues who are here are involved in this work. As Michael said, I've been at the GMP for the president of the largest labor federation here. For those of you who want to know the most unions roughly to say representatives from various unions and their affiliated development regions, labor federations, and workers in the city of New York. So that is my hat that I've worn for the past 13 years, as well as serving in multitude of other boards that are also interested in ensuring an efficient and effective transition between regions, including serve the federal government, Bank of New York, other business partners and business groups as well, industry groups in New York City and others recognizing time stations looking for all of us to get this right. The overarching theme, I think, is we continue to discuss. We talk
Sorry.
how the implementation, particularly of the recent federal policy and the recent legislation, actually creates equity marginalized communities in work, and that is a real issue. So, talk a little bit about organization. That's about 10 years ago. So, for the present. So I think the person is like those people and person that what many of the brothers and that practically rescue is rescue forcefully, proactively. information is just when you feel that you sell it, you continue to sell it. And you also put the more we get wrong, so it's going to become very difficult to do that. Right?
There we go. Now that's gonna be weird. You all, why is it so echoey? Can you hear us now? Right, let's try a hand mic and see what happens. That's good. No, that's gonna be worse. How's that? Very loud. No. Better fixed. Okay, so now in here it's not fixed. All right, let me see if I can turn off the speaker. How's that? Yep. Okay. All right, let's do this. How's that? All right, can everyone hear us online? Hopefully. Perfect. Perfect, they said. Unfortunately, we're kind of whiny in here, but okay.
Okay. That's a little. Can you hear us online? Somebody could just respond to the chat, that'll be it. Yeah, I just want to make sure they're still hearing it.
Okay.
They're hearing it? Good? Okay. No problem. So let me just get this. Let me just move this over here. Okay. So we talked about how we got to the point where we addressed this dual crisis, okay? And what I think is important for us to talk about. Good. Maybe drop that maybe a little bit. Might help us. That's better? That's better, right?
I think so.
You guys can still hear me?
Yeah.
Good.
All
I
right,
think it's
let's try
fine.
that. Okay.
So climate, sometimes people say, well, how is climate a worker issue? How is it impacting equity for working families, for marginalized communities? And we've talked a lot about, oh, let me go back just one slide first. Before there we go. So before we get to that slide about how it's impacting, I'm gonna talk about a very critical statistic and important information about worker productivity, about wages, compensation, and union membership that we talk about often, because we have really over about 50 years, it's been basically my whole adult life of evidence to tell us what we already know, that the decline in worker power reflected by the drop in union density is hitting our earnings relative to profits. And you can see that in these two slides we use them often. There have been a number of years of real growth, as you can see, from working people, but relative to the decades of downward pressure on working families, this really is a drop in a bucket. And you can see how dramatic it is, particularly around 1980, where it changes dramatically. And while productivity continues to increase for working people, that when the drop in union membership declined, that's when you could see hourly compensation, wages, the things that we all talk about now. And workers are out there, people are out there fighting for in the clean energy sector too, as we build out this whole new sector of our economy, that we're making sure that somehow that there is a worker rights are protected and expanded in this new economy, because we know it's going to mean empowering workers all workers, but particularly those who've been marginalized and left behind. So if we, here we go. Okay. So if we move ahead, people say, well, how is climate and worker issue, and how do they intersect, and how are people work, and what condition those people work, those are impacted by climate. This is a slide, these two slides tell a little bit of a story that we talk about often. There is a direct correlation between, as you can see, between communities that are dealing with climate change, with temperature. You can see observed temperatures, observed precipitation, as well as if you look ahead to where you see frontline communities, and this is a map of the 5 boroughs of New York City. We have communities, and these are the flood maps, as you can see, of New York City. You can see that there is an overlay, okay, between where federal poverty levels are, where income levels are, where marginalized communities live, and those communities that are most significantly impacted by climate change. And as I said, it results in a lot of different overlays of a lot of different maps of a lot of different indicators of the economic well-being of working people. So we say, okay, well, they're being impacted by climate change disproportionately. And they're also, how are we going to help them when we change when we implement policy to make sure these communities are lifted up, to make sure that these neighborhoods are changing in a way, and that these communities that have experienced the most pain are going to see ultimately, the greatest, and that we'll see the greatest adversity created by climate change in their neighborhood. We want to reverse that. We want to make sure that we're doing something about that. That is something, as we said, that we see historically over the past several years with different issues, as we said, as they impact workers, and this overlay between the impacts of climate change. So that's something that is important for us to keep in mind as we move forward. There's also, there's also an intersection between a lot of climate and infrastructure needs too. They're all kind of intersecting with each other in a way which is, again, when we get to the investments that are being made by the federal government and the policies which are being implemented, you'll see that these are they're all intersecting and overlapping with each other. You have extreme temperatures, high winds, rainfall, drought, flood, storm surges, and energy supply impacts, health impacts, ecosystem impacts, transportation, water supply, building damage. I can tell you from working in New York City, the infrastructure just around the storm wastewater is just insufficient, and we continue to see, and again, it's in some of the most marginalized communities in New York City. We continue to see these 100-year storms happen like twice or 3 times a year now, and it's impacting them in a variety of different ways. So something to keep in mind as we explore policies and how ultimately, the policy changes that we're looking to make. So this was a conversation, as I said, we had many years ago, the need for labor to be involved in the clean energy transition, because we said workers are going to be left behind if they're not forefront with working with environmental justice groups. New jobs are not going to be jobs of family sustaining wages. Climate change is going to worsen, and major economic opportunities are going to be missed. And we, in the labor movement, we've have a history of making sure that these policies from all these different unions that I work with on a regular basis, many of you may have heard some of these unions, you may have family members that are in these unions. And this is just, as I said, in New York City and New York State, we've now been actively engaged in state coalitions throughout the country that are doing this too, including up here in Connecticut and throughout the New England area, which is a big part of the build out of the offshore wind industry. And we are making sure that all of us, as part of the work that we do, that we're doing everything that we can to assist in the fight in climate change, reverse inequality, and create these family sustaining jobs. We have over a century, when you think about it, of institutional capacity used to impact policymakers in support of pro-worker legislations and budgets and economic development and policies. And we lift the floor, and we always have, for all working people. So the thought was for us is, okay, how do we transition and take that infrastructure and help out as we move forward? And we looked particularly at 3 different areas. We looked at energy policy in New York City. This is because, as I said, different folks in different parts of the country are doing this differently. But we looked at energy policy, we looked at the building sector, and we looked at the transportation sector as well. We also looked more recently, as that's where it started a few years ago, we were looking at workforce development and just transition too, which is a key component of this. On the energy policy side, we can reframe clean energy transition and policy and make this discussion, whether we're talking about generation, whether we're talking about transmission, whether we're talking about the consumption of clean energy, we could reframe those in a way which addresses the equity issues that I think are just necessary if we're going to address that dual crisis of inequality and of climate change. So if you fast forward to where we are over the past couple of years, we've seen this extraordinary investments that have been made by the federal government. $2 trillion more recently in the Jobs Act, CHIPS Act, CHIPS and Science Act, and the IRA. And really, the federal investments, these are historic in nature. We actually, when we first started talking about this 5-7 years ago, we actually we didn't think the federal government was even going to reach this far. And I think from what we saw, what we've seen out there in the world and the advancement of climate change in a way that's more rapid than some of us thought, we said we have to accelerate this and accelerate the federal programs and make sure that we're doing it at the speed that science and the scale that science demands. So the federal government, they went all in on this, and they made a historic $2 trillion investment in infrastructure and in sustainability that now we're all faced with. Okay, we have this enormous sum of money, but there are challenges to it too. The sheer scale of a program like this in multiple federal agencies, the scale of and the various funds and various streams of funding, and you could see that everything from tax incentives to grants to loans, federal operation, it makes this enormously challenging and bureaucratically, I think, difficult at times. The complexity, the amount of participants that we're talking. And recall, and I should have said this earlier, we live in a country that constitutionally we have 50 states. We have a deregulated energy sector, and every sector kind of runs their energy, their generation, the transmission. There's some overlap from state to state at times, but they have an independent approach. They have independent state operators. They have an independent approach to solving and running the energy needs of the states. So my colleagues who I work very closely, for instance, in Texas, they have a very different energy market and a different approach to energy than we do here in New York, than they do in Illinois. We've tended to work more closely with our folks, I would say, in the mid-Atlantic to the Northeast because of the offshore wind industry, and so much attention has been paid to that. but there's a complexity and the amount of participants. And we have many startups now that are involved, and many established businesses, and we have various governments and various layers of government as well. And then the accountability and the compliance and impact. Are they actually doing what they're told, what they've been tasked to do under the grants? And are they in compliance? And for many people, and one of the things that we applauded the president for doing was to include strong labor standards in the federal legislation, including prevailing wage protections, and supporting apprenticeship programs. But for a lot of folks, they have to know how to navigate through these and make sure that they are in compliance, even if they have a desire to be in compliance. How does the federal government, working in multiple different agencies with 50 states, multiple different energy agencies from different states? In New York, we have NYSERDA, which is a primary agency that we work through, but it varies greatly from state to state. And how are they going to do this in a way which actually gets that money, gets that $2 trillion out into the states, into the cities and into the locales through various agencies, and have that be distributed in a way that's effective ultimately, and doing it effective ultimately at trying to mitigate the effects of climate change, reverse climate change, while at the same time also making sure that we're addressing marginalized communities and lifting up working families in doing this. So this is a really, really challenging goal. U.S. renewable generation was about 22% in 2023. We're all seeking to accelerate and get those goals and reach the goals that various cities, various states have reached, and they've set the bar pretty high. In New York City, we've set the bar pretty high, as well as New York State. But again, the inability to take all of the funding commitments from the federal government on these three particular pieces of legislation, the major legislation, and trying to get it out through all these various agencies and various programs, and as you can see from these two grants, is an enormous task. It really is. So we're looking to help and see what we could do in any way. We're seeking to rebuild the entire American infrastructure, accelerate the transition to green energy economy, and strengthen at the same time the domestic semiconductor industry, all while promoting job growth, workforce development, and equity. So it's a big challenge, to say the least. So just a couple more slides just to talk about some of this work. Offshore wind has been a major component of the work that we're doing here in New York. Our energy sector and so many of the goals that we set forth in New York State, and the projects that are being planned off the coast of New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Maine, Virginia, are really going to, I think are really going to be, not only going to be challenging for a variety of different reasons, but they're also have the potential to, again, to create strong union jobs. In New York State, through state legislation, we made a commitment not only on the construction of the offshore wind towers, we made a commitment to all of the work being done using project labor agreements, which our unions enter into often, to ensure that we have strong labor standards and workplace protections and safety and the training that's necessary on those jobs, and prevailing wage protections as well. But more importantly, on the non-construction permanent related jobs, we've contributed to labor peace agreement, which is a formal agreement between employers and workers to ensure that workers have a right to have a voice in that workplace through collective bargaining, and then have the benefits that come along with that go along with collective bargaining, which, by the way, is really substantial. You know, people always say, well, to me, well, what's the difference? We know the graphs, and you saw that graph before that we showed you with wages and productivity and what's happened with unions going on. I said, well, it's a huge difference. You know, I mean, if you look, it varies from year to year, but like over the past years, it's like 11.2% roughly higher wage level, job to job, education level to education level, versus union workers versus non-union workers. There's a 96, so if you talk about workers who have access to healthcare, unionized workers have 96%, 96% of union workers have access to healthcare versus 69% of non-union workers. If you talk about paid sick leave, 93% of unionized workers have access to paid sick leave. 69% have access of non-union workers have access to it. If you talk about a traditional pension that maybe of your parents have, a traditional defined benefit pension, not just a 401k plan or something along those lines, 79% of unionized workers have that, including myself, versus 17% of non-union workers. And also, these statistics and data are available on the National AFL-CIO's website. But also, if you look deeper into like the outcomes within society in highly unionized in highly unionized jurisdictions, either cities or state versus non, you're going to see health outcomes and other outcomes that I think you're going to understand that there really is a union difference. And that's something why we're trying to, as we talk about building out the clean energy sector, why we're so adamant about making sure that we get it right. We're working very closely, not only, as I said, in the energy sector, with the development of and the generation and the transmission of clean energy, but also in the building sector. This is like a project like that we've been working on more recently in New York City. We have about 1,100 school buildings. That's just elementary and high schools. It doesn't include schools in the university system. We're working on carbon-free, healthy schools, healthy public buildings, and transition all of the schools in K through 12 to net zero by 2030. There is a willingness, I would say, to do this, certainly on the part of policymakers, but how you go about doing this is one that's really, really complicated for them, and one that I think has shown me and illuminated to me how just really truly complex this is. Like, where do you start? We have 1,100 buildings in the 5 boroughs of New York City, and it's the job creation potential is enormous on either building out new schools and using the funding that is coming from the federal funding from either the Jobs and Infrastructure Act or from the Inflation Reduction Act. There are possibilities there, but then again, the knowledge of how to go about secure those grants, secure the direct funding, or secure the loans, and making sure that the city can take advantage of those programs is one where there's a desire, but we're working very closely to see if we could take truly advantage of that. Because again, we know that the outcomes, and if you talk to teachers, if you talk to educators, they'll tell you, 25% of New York City schools do not even have ventilation, air conditioning. If you talk to workers who work in the cafeterias, they'll tell you our ventilation usually is we leave the door open, we put a brick behind the door, and we hope that air comes through. And as you're working in cafeterias that, in the summer are regularly over 100 degrees. Lighting, air, all the different things that go into making a school, water containment systems, I visited a net zero school in Staten Island. I can tell you the students, the teachers, the administrators, the parents, and the workers all in the building, all agreed that this is not only a healthier and a more pleasant place to work, but that the outcomes for students were actually better. Everybody was all in on this. So that's something when you talk about public buildings, how we go about doing that. Private buildings, they have a law too, a local law 97, which is more complex, certainly to implement, but one that we're working on as well and trying to use federal funding for that. Transportation sector, expanding bus rapid transit for workers and focused on transit electrification. Again, you got to build up electrification. You got to transition fleets. We want to make sure that as we're transitioning fleets, we're not offshoring, to the extent that we can build out a domestic supply chain for a lot of the equipment that we're going to be building them right here at home. We talked about that with the semiconductor industry, the offshore wind industry. Just to go back to for 1 second, again, it's like we're trying to build out a domestic supply chain. We're trying to use the federal funding to make sure that we're conducting an accelerated build out and a transition to clean energy. But while we're doing it, the whole concept is, regardless of what state you're in, regardless of what city you're in, regardless of what sector of the economy you're talking about transitioning to clean energy and where the funds are coming from, to make sure that we're doing it in a way that's going to lift working people up. It's going to create the economic impact that we want to create and the growth that we want to create the jobs, but make sure that they're decent jobs and make sure that workers have have the opportunity to take advantage, and maybe marginalized communities have the opportunity to be lifted up and not left behind. Expand bus rapid transit into more traditionally lower income communities that haven't had the opportunity to do that. Invest in our public transportation system, in green technology with our public transportation system, but expanding it in a way that people get out of their cars and into public transit, into public transportation would be positive, would be a real positive first step. And then just lastly, where we just transition from all of this, and as I said, you have this enormous bucket of federal funding now, is that we in the labor movement, we've always viewed everything around campaigns. When we go out there and we fight for workers' rights, and we're trying to implement policies with the federal government that are going to help support workers' rights and expand worker rights, which are going to produce budgets which are important for everyday working people and working class communities, but also on the private sector side too. When we're dealing with private sector employers, like we had run a campaign for the past 2 years at Starbucks, and we finally reached a breakthrough with the Starbucks campaign to help lift up those workers. So what we're trying to do is take the campaign infrastructure and mindset that we've been really having for 100 years, where we educate and build support around an issue, where we create public campaigns, where we implement policy at a local level, which ultimately is where it's going to have to be implemented at the state and local level. That's where energy policy is being created. And then we have to do it at the scale and the speed that science demands. So that is our overall kind of approach organizationally and programmatically to how we're viewing climate change and the transition to clean energy sector. As I said, we don't detach them. We connect the two together. We make sure that we're addressing having the presence of strong labor standards to address inequality, but also address the crisis of climate change. Take advantage of the massive federal investments that are currently out there, uplift workers, create strong domestic jobs with strong labor standards, and historically run the campaigns that we run and that we've done literally for over 100 years in this country in various forms, but run those strong trades, create these jobs, support high quality jobs, and give a voice to workers and marginalized communities throughout this country. So that's a broad kind of overview of the work we're doing. Michael, I'm not sure if they want to move to some questions, discussion. I'm fine with that. I think we only have folks online for a little while, for a few more minutes, but.
There's no question.
Okay.
But I would just say, let me ask a question about the labor at different scales of projects. Right? You do green hydrogen cloud,
Yep.
versus school. What are some of the labor dynamics?
Yep. Yeah, I think oh, sure. So the question was like green hydrogen hubs versus a much more localized clean energy transition project like carbon-free healthy schools. What unions are involved? So I would say with the hydrogen, with the green hydrogen hubs, you have workers that are, I think, much more involved with the construction and the operations of those, that are much more clearly involved, because some of them also are seeing, remember, we represent energy workers too. I call them energy workers, I said, because I would say that's how we have to view ourselves as. You know, you're not necessarily a coal worker, you're not necessarily an electric worker, you're not necessarily a utility, you're an energy worker. And we are transitioning society to a clean energy, and we're in the process of a clean energy transition. So I would say you have more workers who are directly impacted with construction of, operations and maintenance of the green hydrogen hubs, who have a real interest and a desire to understand the technology, one, how it works, how potentially if there's going to see a transition from some of their workers, if you worked on, say, like a nuclear facility that's being decommissioned like Indian Point in New York, or if you are working, you know, maybe in gas jobs, or some jobs that you may see different jobs that are going to be transitioning. So you have workers that are exploring opportunities in those as well and supporting that. Whereas with the carbon-free healthy schools kind of campaigns, with the building campaigns, and also I would say residential campaigns too, like local law 97 in New York City, which is a big implementation of very lofty climate goals, but really is going to impact residents. And we know about the affordability crisis in New York City as in other places around the country, and the cost of housing is a huge issue. So they'll say like, okay, we have this federal money, we have all this money that's out there, we want to transition where we live, we want to transition to buildings where we work, we want to transition to the buildings where where our children go to school or where we work as well. We think that all those are worthy goals, but how do we do it in a way that's actually costly, feasible? How is it financially feasible for us? How is it, and those are questions where I think people are saying, okay, we have these massive federal subsidies. How do we get those down to the local level quickly to do that? We have worker cooperatives in New York City many of them were created, by the way, too, by the labor movement 60, 70 years ago. On your Penn South, Amalgamated War Base houses, Elecchester Housing in Queens, Co-op City. They have bylaws which limit the amount of rents, which is a good thing. Housing cooperatives, which put limits on the costs that they have to, that the tenants have to bear. But it also then, what it does is it puts them in a very difficult position if they have to transition their buildings to cleaner energy kind of technology. So the federal government, we're working with different, and it's not just the federal government, it's also not-for-profit sector and other financial investment communities that want to see this transition, want to help out, is how do you get the money and how do you get it down at the local level where they could tap into those to help if they have to borrow money to ultimately transition these buildings. So it's one is more end user, consumer, I would say, with the buildings concern and involvement on the union side, whereas the other is more development and construction of the facilities as well as operations. Slightly different. Yep. Yes. Yeah.
They all feel like they're.
Well, they're all, I mean, they're also, the answer is yes. You have construction unions that are going to work at either retrofitting a building or building a whole new, if you're building a new building, a net zero building, a school building, for instance. But they all have a common desire to see that either building be retrofitted or built out in a way that has the lowest carbon footprint. So they're all supported. They're all part, as you saw this slide that I put up before about all the various unions. We have unions from construction trade unions, private sector unions, public sector unions, federations that are all working together on this because they're all bought into this. It's like, hey, this is good for society. We want to do this. And now we have this enormous pot of money. They're trying to develop a greater understanding of the technology, but also how ultimately we implement it. The implementation is the key here, and it is challenging on these various programs.
To follow up, you feel like when you work nationally, it's the same landscape. You feel like workers in other states and other regions are equally willing to sort of just say, hey, I'm an energy worker, I'm a coal worker, or is there more?
I think. Yeah, look, I think it's changed dramatically. I think there are more and more people who recognize that this is something that's needed for society. I think it's generational too. I think with the younger generation, this is kind of just, I think this is a positive thing. It's baked into their culture. They know that transitioning to kind of a net zero, a renewable energy, a future where renewable energy is being implemented and come online at the way that we know could really transform society. I think that for them, it's just let's get there. Why wouldn't we want to get there? Let's figure out how to do it in the most efficient manner. But I think, look, unions have a primary obligation of representing their workforces, both the work opportunity and the wages and the benefits that they have. And for some of them, they are real, like, legitimate concerns. And that's where you get into just transition. Like, what does a just transition really look like? It's two nice words, but what does it mean? Because a just transition for a worker maybe who's in the later stages of their career, you know, giving them a job 2 or 3 states away 4 years from now, that's not a just transition. Not recognizing the impacts on a community, maybe where you're transitioning away from a certain energy that really meant a lot financially to a community. It was a huge source of revenue for a community, and to not discuss how that's going to impact a community, how it's going to impact the tax base, real estate values, without an understanding of that, of a just transition, not just for workers, but for the communities that are going to be impacted by it, I think is a real mistake, and one that we want to try to avoid to the extent that we can. As I mentioned in the point, that's going to have an impact on the community. It's something, by the way, that the utility workers supported, which I thought was, it really was, people thought like, wow, this is amazing. We have utility workers that are saying, we'll go along with this, but let's transition our workers properly. Let's make sure, it's like 500 or so workers they had up there. Let's make sure that they're not impacted disproportionately. And if they need retraining, workforce development comes into this. And there's usually a workforce development component, and that's accelerating on most of these federal programs too. So this is the challenge of the ecosystem, kind of different lenses, different actors, different sectors of the energy sector, and looks very different in 50 states. Yep.
You talk about the education that you need to provide in high school, but also the professional trades, quote unquote, versus going to 4-year college. I'm not quite sure what you mean by that.
Well, what we try to do, maybe the question was about trade versus 4-year colleges was part of that. What we try to do is educate people about like the opportunities that they have. You know, college isn't desirable or a path that everybody wants to take, but by the way, you know, quite often you have to go to college in order to be able to enter an apprenticeship or some of these programs as well. It's needed. I mean, if you're a teaching professional and representative of one of the teachers, I mean, the amount of education that they have to go through is really pretty remarkable, as well as folks who work in healthcare and other things. So I think that I don't think they're necessarily mutually exclusive. I think you do need both, but for some, it's a different career path. We do career fairs often. And I think that we want to make sure that people understand that we're not just trying to provide people a track to a short-term job, but a long-term career. And there's a big difference between a short-term job and obviously in a long-term career. And as I said, I'm a pretty good example. I went in for a 3-month job, and here I am 34 years later, still in the labor movement. So we want to try to make sure that we make the connection to apprenticeship programs. And it's not just apprenticeship programs, by the way, in construction, but we have various other apprenticeship programs too. And then as far as just generally educating, just like educating people on the need to how do you build up the domestic, say, like supply chain? You know, that's like, how do we even do that? What does that look like? You know, my colleagues let me get this right, Rhode Island recently, in the past couple months, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, I think it was Connecticut too. I don't think it was New Hampshire. I think it was Connecticut. They did a tri-state pact on approach to the supply chain, permanent jobs in the supply chain and offshore wind. How can we approach it? Because they know there's going to be a little overlap, even though it might be coming out of, the state pier over here in Connecticut, or up in, one of the big projects up in Massachusetts. There's going to be overlap. So how do we approach it? Maybe we have a regional kind of approach to building out a supply chain, a domestic supply chain that's going to help workers secure jobs with strong labor standards. Yeah, because otherwise we run the risk of just having a set of offshore jobs. So anyway.
Well, I think that's it for our online.
Very good.
Last question. We'll come sit down.
Sure. Perfect.
All right. Bye, everybody online. Thanks again. See you next week, or we'll be covering Native folks and energy justice, and an amazing speaker from Native Energy will be with us. See you next week.